Okay, so ready to start? Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Today is October 6th, 2012. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, so we're continuing now with the examination of the Angulimala Sutta. This is Sutta number 86 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And last week, first I spoke a little bit about the background story of Angulimala, which comes from the commentary. And then we examined the sutta up through the conversion experience of Angulimala. I think we only got through about paragraphs of section 7 last week. Is that correct? Okay, so now we're continuing from section 8 in the sutta. So at this point, the Buddha has gone out to meet Angulimala in the forest, and by means of a feat of supernormal power, he has first bewildered Angulimala and then transformed him, so that Angulimala, after hearing the Buddha's teaching on non-harming other living beings, he's thrown away all of his weapons, and he's vowed to give up killing and harming living beings. And then he bows down to the at the Buddha's feet, and then he requests the Buddha to give him ordination as a monk. And then the Buddha addresses him with the words, "Come, bhikkhu," which means that with those words, Angulimala becomes a monk. And so then the Buddha returns from the great forest, or the Jalani forest. He comes back to Savatthi, to Jeta's grove, with Angulimala accompanying him. And so then they are living together at Jeta's grove. Okay, now we come to paragraph 8. And now a great crowd of people, or great crowds of people, have been gathering at the gates of King Pasenadi's palace, and they're crying out, "Oh, your Majesty, you have this terrible serial killer, Angulimala, in your realm, who's going around murderous, bloody-handed, merciless to living beings, and he's obliterating whole villages, towns, and districts of their people. He kills the people, and he cuts off their fingers, and he strings the finger bones together as a garland and wears it around his neck." So that's why he's called Angulimala. As I explained last week, it means one who wears a garland of fingers. And so the people petition the king and say, "Your Majesty, you have to put him down. You have to capture him and kill him or imprison him." Okay, so then one day, King Pasenadi sets out from Savatthi with 500 cavalry. 500, it's always used to indicate a large number. And for some reason they come first to Jeta's grove to see the Buddha. maybe he wants to get the blessings of the Buddha before going to attack Angulimala. Okay, and so he comes up to the boundary of the park, then he walks the rest of the way, probably accompanied by several of his cavalrymen. He comes up to the Buddha and he pays homage to the Buddha, and the Buddha sees him with this great army sort of waiting outside the bounds of the monastery, and probably with, a battalion, a group of soldiers accompanying him. So the Buddha asked the king, what is going on here, O king? Is King Sania Bimbisara, that's the king of Magadha, a powerful neighboring state, attacking you? Or the Lichavis of Vaisali? The Lichavis, they were a republic to the south of the state of Kosala, or some other hostile king. And then King Pasenadi explains that it's none of these kings or other states that are about to attack him, but he explains that in his realm there's this terrible murderer named Angulimala, who's always killing people and forming a garland from their fingers. Then there was actually a mistranslation here. The last sentence in paragraph 10, do you have in your edition, I shall never be able to put him down? It should actually read, I shall put him down, Venerable Sir. Okay, so King Pasenadi, with this, he declares that he is on the way to enter into the great forest and to search for Angulimala with all of his soldiers, to capture him and either kill him or imprison him. But now the Buddha is going to surprise King Pasenadi. And he does so by asking a question, almost as if, it would seem almost to King Pasenadi, almost as if the Buddha is pulling his legs or trying to play a joke on him. The Buddha says, Great King, suppose you were to see that Angulimala had shaved off his hair and his beard, had put on the ochre robes, and had gone forth from the home life into homelessness. That would seem almost very, very unlikely, very improbable. And then not only had he gone forth to become a monk, but he had taken upon himself the vows to abstain from killing living beings. From taking what is not given, from stealing, from false speech, that he's eating only one meal a day, and that he is celibate, observing brahmacharya or celibacy, virtuous, and of good character. So this is sort of laid out as a hypothetical, just so the Buddha can ask, how would you treat him if you were to see Angulimala in such a condition? And then King Pasenadi replies that he would treat him just in the same way as he would treat any other venerable monk. He says, Bhante, I would pay homage to him, and I would rise up for him if he comes into a room. I would invite him to a seat, and then I would offer him to accept new robes, to accept an offering of alms food. I would have a dwelling place constructed for him. I could offer him any medicines he might need. And then he says, or I could certainly arrange for him lawful guarding, defense, and protection. Because normally the king wouldn't offer that to another monk, but in the case of Angulimala, The king would think that other people would be ready to come and catch him and kill him. So Angulimala might need a special protecting guards around him. But then the king says, in a sense, he says to the Buddha, of course that's a ridiculous idea. That terrible killer who's so evil, so bloody-handed, how could he ever be so virtuous and restrain himself by such rigorous precepts? Okay, at the time it said that the Venerable Angulimala was sitting not far from the Buddha. And so then the Buddha extends his right arm, certainly in the direction of Angulimala, so that the king's attention, his head turns in the direction of the Buddha's hand. And the Buddha says to King Pasenadi, "Great king, do you see that monk sitting there? That's Angulimala." And first, probably the king went through a moment of utter disbelief, but then when he looked again, he would have seen that, this was not like a small-sized monk, but probably a big monk with strong arms, big chest, very powerful-looking face. So he sees him sitting there. And then when the idea occurs, perhaps that is Angulimala. He becomes frightened, alarmed, and terrified. If Angulimala is just killing people, here I am with just a few soldiers around me. Maybe Angulimala is going to come and get me. Is this working, or did it go out?
There's some battery might have died. Is that battery on?
Usually it gives a signal when the battery goes out. Well, maybe that is a low. The red light. Oh yeah, usually it's green when it's normal, I think. Okay, anyway, those are new batteries now.
Is it that? Yep.
Testing. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Is my voice coming through clear in the back? Can you hear me clearly? Okay. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. Testing. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
What about the wire
Test. Oops. Yeah, okay, it's working. Perhaps there was something back here. Okay, bring it down. Okay. Okay, so the king is frightened, terrified. And so then the Buddha reassures him. Probably the Buddha puts up his hand like this and says, "Do not be afraid, great king, do not be afraid. You have no reason to be afraid of Angulimala." Okay, when the Buddha speaks, then of course the king has full confidence in him. So the king calms down and all of his fear dissipates. And then the king goes over to Angulimala, and we have to remember that to remind you of what I said last week, that Angulimala was the son of one of the Brahmins in the court of King Pasenadi. So King Pasenadi would have known Angulimala's father very well, and of course he would have seen Angulimala when he was a boy and a young man, before Angulimala went off apparently to study in Takshila. And also Angulimala, as I mentioned, was not his real name, but Angulimala was just a sobriquet, a nickname given to him because he wore the garland of fingers around his neck. So the king comes up to Angulimala now, and he says, "Venerable Sir, is the noble Lord," that's a kind of polite way of addressing a monk, "is the noble Lord really Angulimala?" And Angulimala says, "Yes." And now the king wants to test him to make, maybe the king is still not completely ready to believe that this is Angulimala. So the king is going to test this monk in front of him by asking about his family name. So he says, "Venerable Sir, of what family is your father? And of what family is your mother?" Because King Pasenadi knows the father and mother. So Angulimala says, "My father is a Gaga." A Gaga must be the family, a particular Brahmin family name. And my mother is from the Mantani line. So then the king says, he addresses him now by his proper name. So he says, "Let the noble Lord Gaga Mantani Puta," that's the one whose father's name is Gaga and who is the son of the woman Mantani, "rest content. I shall provide robes, alms food, a dwelling place, and medicines to the Venerable Gaga Mantani Puta." Okay, so the king wants to show his respect and reverence to this venerable one who's Angulimala by making the offering to him of what are called the 4 requisites. But it's said that at the time, the Venerable Angulimala was a forest dweller, an alms food eater, I'll explain what each of these terms mean, a refuse rag wearer, and he restricted himself to 3 robes. Okay, now these, what's stated here, are certain ascetic practices that many of the monks in the Buddha's time, even at present, undertake. By being a forest dweller, it means that Angulimala doesn't dwell regularly within the boundaries of a town or a city, but he lives in a remote lodging someplace in the forest. Last week, I think it was in the discussion period, Richard pointed out that there seems to be a little bit of a little textual problem here, in that we get the impression that this whole incident is taking place almost very soon after Angulimala returned with the Buddha to Jeta's grove. So if that is the case, that he didn't have any time to go off to become a forest dweller. He comes back with the Buddha and they're living together in Jeta's grove. And Jeta's grove is just outside the city of Savatthi. So when did Angulimala get to be a forest dweller? Except when he was the murderer, then he was living in the forest. But it wouldn't make sense for him to be described as a forest dweller at that time. Perhaps there's actually a longer time interval here than the text suggests, so that after Angulimala returned with the Buddha to Jeta's grove, he learned some of the basics, some of the basic Dharma teachings, some of the ways of the monk's life, and then maybe after a few weeks he went off to live in the forest. Then after a few months in the forest he came back to Jeta's grove, and just at that time King Pasenadi was going out to catch him. But maybe there's just also maybe that's too neat an explanation, and maybe the real explanation is that the text is trying to build up the ascetic qualities of Angulimala to highlight the contrast between his earlier way of life as a vicious, brutal murderer and his present way of life, not simply as a monk, but as a monk who's observing very strict ascetic practices. Okay, so Angulimala, he's described as a forest dweller. Now, an alms food eater, in a sense, we always say that every food, all the food that a monk eats is considered alms food. So even when when I go up to the dining hall and then the food is put out on trays and I take it, and all of the monks and nuns take it, we still say that this is alms food because it's always offered to us. But in the strict sense, what is meant by an alms food eater is somebody who makes the vow not to accept any food that's brought to a temple or monastery and given to him, and doesn't accept invitations to go to houses to accept a meal, but rather he makes the vow to eat only the food that he collects in his alms bowl by going from door to door. And so if he goes on alms round and he gets a lot, as sometimes happens, then he'll bring it back to the monastery and share it with the other monks. If he gets a little, then he just makes good for the day with a little. So one just takes one's chances, because as one goes to different places on different days, things will balance out. Some days one will get a lot, some days a little, but generally one will get enough to support oneself. During my own days in Sri Lanka, sometimes, especially when I was staying in the city, I used to like to go on alms round, but many days one has to do with what we used to call bananas and bread days. So people are not expecting the monk to come on alms round, they don't have any food prepared. So one house will give a slice of bread, another house will give a few bananas, and then one just collects some bread and bananas and goes back to the monastery, and one subsists for the day on bread and bananas. I mean, it's a lot more than a lot of other people get each day. And then usually if you go to one area, the first day you get bread and bananas, but if you go there for the following 3 days and people are expecting you, then they'll have food prepared waiting for you when you come. So if you become a monk in Colombo, I can tell you the good streets. I had a friend in Sri Lanka at that time. when I was finished preparing the edition of the Majjhima Nikaya, and I was writing the introduction, he said, make it a point in the introduction to drop indications of what are the good streets for alms round in Colombo. I said, I'll try to get that in, but I don't know how I'm going to do it. Then he came to visit me a few months ago, and he said, you know, I looked at your version of the Majjhima Nikaya and I'm really disappointed in it. I said, why? A lot of people are liking it. And he said, remember we made an agreement that you would indicate the good streets for alms round in Colombo? I read the introduction and you didn't say anything about that. Okay, so that's the practice of the alms food eater. What's called the refuse wearer means that one makes the vow not to wear ready-made robes. Like this is a ready-made robe. So, it's already, the pieces of cloth are already sewed together, by probably a professional seamstress, is that what they call it? Tailor, then dyed a nice color and folded nicely and just ready to wear. But a refuse robe means that There are some monks, and even today there are some, but not as many, who make the vow to prepare their robe from pieces of cloth that they will find discarded. And usually the way they would get what they call the refuse rag is to go to the charnel ground. In the charnel ground they wrap, I hope, this is, again, I have to put the warning for those with rather sensitive minds. I'll give you 30 seconds to leave. They go to the charnel ground where they wrap the dead bodies in this white cloth and just discard the bodies. Or maybe they just take a cloth to cover up the private parts and cast the body there. And so then the monk who wants to make a rag robe would go to the charnel ground with a knife and cut off pieces of cloth and bring them, after collecting enough pieces, bring them back to the monastery and then cut them into the proper rectangular shapes and make the strips and sew them together, then wash all of the cloth, dye it, and then he'll wear that as a refuse rag robe. They call it pangsakula. Literally it means a dust cloth. Okay, and then he restricted himself to 3 robes. So basically the monk's sort of outfit consists of 3 robes. There's the underrobe, which is somewhat like a sarong. That's what the Indian and in India and traditional Sri Lanka wear. Like a little bit like a skirt, like a long skirt. Then there is this is the upper robe, and then there's something sometimes called an outer robe or a cloak, which is exactly like the upper robe, except it's double thick. So when the weather gets cold, as it sometimes does even in South Asia, one will put that cloak over the upper robe, so you have even at that triple thickness. This is a single piece of cloth. The cloak is a double piece of cloth, and so that will protect one from the cold. But sometimes monks, because they have to wash robes, and so they'll also have extra robes apart from those 3. But somebody who wants to observe the ascetic practice makes the vow to use only 3 robes. Actually, they'll have 3 robes and then usually something called the bathing cloth, because you have to wash the underrobe, and so if you're washing the underrobe, you have to wear something around the lower part of one's body. So then one uses the bathing cloth when washing the lower robe. If one is washing the upper robe, then one uses the outer robe or the cloak in its place till it gets dry. Okay, so coming back now, King Pasenadi has offered to provide all of these requisites to Angulimala, and Angulimala politely refuses and says, "Enough, great king, my 3 robes are complete," which means that he's refusing these offerings. You remember in an earlier sutta, in the Gatikara sutta about the potter, King Kiki had sent all of this foodstuffs, cartloads of red rice and other foodstuffs to the potter Gatikara, and then the potter Gatikara had politely refused it and said, "The king is very busy and has much to do. I have enough. Let this be. Let this go back to the king himself." So this is showing the quality of fewness of wishes on the part of a layperson. And now this is showing the quality of fewness of wishes on the part of the monk. He says, "Enough, great king. I already have everything I need. The 3 robes are complete. I'm getting my food on alms round. And I'm living in the forest, so I don't need a dwelling built for me." Okay, so now when King Pasenadi hears that, then he comes back to the Buddha, and then he says to the Buddha, It's wonderful, or it's amazing, Bhante. It's astounding, Bhante. How the Blessed One tames the untamed, brings peace to the unpeaceful, or makes the unpeaceful, the violent, become peaceful, and leads to Nibbana those who have not attained Nibbana. Actually, this is a kind of rather awkward translation from the Pali, which would say something like he extinguishes, or that's not so good. Maybe tranquilizes those who are untranquil, since that's the sort of root meaning of Nibbana. Then the king says, Bhante, I myself couldn't tame him with force and weapons, yet the Blessed One, the Buddha, has tamed him without using force or weapons. And then the standard way of sort of taking leave is to say, now, Venerable Sir, I have to depart. I'm busy and I have a lot of things to take care of. Okay, and then the Buddha permits the king to go, and then the king departs and goes back to the palace without making any attempt to capture Angulimala. Anybody have any questions or comments on this much? Dana?
Just a curiosity, alms round. In Sri Lanka, there's lots of bananas growing on trees. Are you allowed to just pick?
No. One has to always receive things that are offered to one. Even in the monastery, usually people will come to the will come bringing food to the monastery. And sometimes if food is left in the monastery, there will be like an attendant in the monastery who will take everything and then offer it to the monks. So it is not allowed to collect one's own food by picking it off trees or growing it, picking it out from the soil.
I just wondered why.
This was a convention in the time of the Buddha that those who give up the household life, put themselves in a position of what they call living on faith or trust in the generosity of the householders. And it was already like a well-established convention, not only amongst the Buddhists, but all of the ascetic communities. Their followers would always depend on either going on alms round or else depending on lay people to come to their monasteries or their dwelling places to make offerings to them. And so that would establish a kind of bond of solidarity between the renunciants and the lay people. And this would be convention followed in relation to the ascetics and wanderers of any tradition. So it wouldn't be the case that Buddhist lay followers would only give alms to the Buddhist monks and nuns, not to the others. But there would be wanderers of belonging to the Jains, the Ajivakas, various other sects, sannyasis, and they would all live on going on alms round. And so lay people would always bring forth this mind of generosity and support them by making offerings whenever they come.
Thanks.
And that convention still continues, and especially in Burma and Thailand. In Sri Lanka, it's become not so common for monks to go on alms round, but some do. And in some monasteries, more recently, there's been a tendency to revive that practice. Yeah.
Continuing on the previous question, would it be okay for someone to give you money instead of food?
No. One is not supposed to receive money in place of alms food. And so it's known that, when monks are on alms round, that sometimes people will give money, and if the monk has like an attendant with him, a lay attendant, they'll give a little packet with a red envelope. Usually they don't give they won't even give the bill, directly from hand to hand, but usually it's put in an envelope. Give it to the lay attendant and say, if the Venerable needs anything extra, you can buy for him. But in these countries like Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, generally lay people, if they're expecting the monk, they'll already have something prepared. If the monk turns up unexpectedly, they'll give slices of bread or some fruits that they have available. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so let's go on. Okay, this is an important incident that is put in here in the sutta. Okay, so it's taking like one incident in the later life of Angulimala after he's been a monk for some time. Okay, so one day in the morning, the Venerable Angulimala dressed and taking his bowl and outer robe, he went into Savatthi for alms. Okay, as he was walking for alms from house to house, he saw a certain woman in difficult labor, that is, having difficulty in giving birth, not doing some difficult work like breaking stones. So she was in difficult labor, in painful labor, and it says that, I think the commentary says that what happened is that we call it the fetus, still at that point, had turned in the wrong direction when coming out through the birth canal, so that the fetus had gotten stuck in her birth canal. And so if she had continued in that condition, probably both of them would have died. Okay, so when Angulimala saw this, he thought, how sentient beings are afflicted. Indeed, how beings are afflicted. Okay, then after he collects his alms in Savatthi, then he went back to the Buddha and he reported to the Buddha what he had seen and the thought that came into his mind. And now the Buddha gives Angulimala some instruction. He says, in that case, Angulimala, go back into Savatthi and say to that woman, Sister, since I was born, I do not recall that I have ever intentionally deprived a living being of life. By this truth, may you be well, and may your infant be well. Now when Angulimala heard that, he must have been surprised, assuming this is a historical incident, because Angulimala, his reputation was that of a vicious serial killer who had killed many, many people, according to the commentarial tradition, 999 people. And now he's being instructed by the Buddha to go back and say that I have never intentionally killed a living being. So Angulimala, this doubt rose up in his mind so that he has to even raise an objection to the Buddha, and he says, Bhante, in that case, wouldn't I be telling a deliberate lie? For I have intentionally deprived many living beings of life. So then the Buddha says to Angulimala, in that case, go into Savatthi and say to that woman, Sister, since I was born with a noble birth, Aryaya Jataya Jato, since I was born with a noble birth, I don't recall that I have ever intentionally deprived a living being of life. By this truth, may you be well, and may your infant be well. Okay, so Angulimala, now he can accept the Buddha's instruction, and so he goes back into Savatthi and he repeats in the presence of that woman, he says to her, "Sister, since I was born with the noble birth, I do not recall that I have ever intentionally deprived a living being of life. By this truth may you be well, and may your infant be well." And then when Angulimala said that, then the delivery, or the woman's delivery changed. Apparently the infant sort of swerved around into the proper direction, came out smoothly, without any affliction to the infant or to the mother. And so the woman and the infant became well. Now this is a practice that goes back to ancient Indian tradition, probably even before the time of the Buddha. There's a technical term for it, which is called Satya-kirya. This is called Satya in Pali, Satya-kirya, which means literally a doing of truth. Or we can say, maybe translate it more freely, a declaration of truth. And it's related a bit to an expression that became well known even in English through the practice of Gandhi, satyagraha. Satyagraha means grasping of truth, or holding to truth. So I think Gandhi used that in relation to like the long fasts that he would undertake to bring down the British, or to the marches, the non-violent marches. So one does something with the intention of it being an expression of one's truth. But the older Indian practice is that of making a declaration, which is a way of revealing one's innermost truth. And when one makes that declaration, it's supposed to set up a kind of mystical, almost magical, spiritual power, which brings about the fulfillment of a benevolent wish. For example, there's one story which is told within the Indian tradition. I don't know the original source of it, but there was a great flood pouring down from the river, and it was threatening to overflow the banks of the river and to inundate the villages and the towns along the Ganges. And so people were wondering, how can we stop this terrible river from overflowing and destroying all of our villages and towns? And then there was one woman who was a courtesan, like a high-class prostitute. And she said, "I will save you all." And she came in front of the whole crowd of people, and she said, she made this declaration, "Ever since I was a young girl, I have been working as a courtesan, but through all of these years, I have never discriminated between any of my clients on the basis of their wealth or class status, whether it's a simple man or a powerful prince or a wealthy merchant. As long as they pay the fee, I treat them all the same. And when she made that declaration, the river shrank into its normal, the banks, and started to flow, at a reduced velocity, and all of the villages and towns were saved. Okay, so in this case, Angulimala is making, this is a declaration of truth. He's saying that since he has been born with a noble birth, he's never killed any living being. And then through the spiritual power of that declaration, the woman in difficult labor becomes well and the child comes out safely. And now, even today, going down the centuries, probably through all of the centuries, right down to present-day Sri Lanka, this is used when women get pregnant, Buddhist women, when it's coming close to the time of their delivery. It's the common custom for them to go to the Buddhist temple, the Buddhist monastery, and ask the monks to recite some protective stanzas for them. And this verse of Angulimala, this becomes the protective, sort of the main protective stanza in the ceremony. Richard, you were going to say something?
Yeah, but why does Angulimala think that this is any less a lie than the original version? That is, he still has killed all of these people, so how can this be a declaration of truth?
Because he's changed it from since I was born to since I was born by a noble birth. And what is meant here by being born by a noble birth?
Well, but that's ambiguous in the text because, presumably what he means is since he has been born as a monk, that is since his stream entry, but he's also, that is, his parents are also nobles, right?
Oh, that's...
My mother is Gaga, and my mother is Gaga, and then the noble Lord Gaga, so that's a noble, his first birth was a noble birth.
Yeah, but that's not what is intended here. And I think it's clear... I think it's very clear from the context that what is meant by the noble birth, I don't know that the text would use the word Arya in relation to somebody who is a noble one in secular society. Then they would say, since I was born as a Kshatriya.
Well, that is in the, when it says, let the noble Lord Gaga Mantani Puta rest content, is the word that the king is using for noble the same as the word that the Buddha is using for noble?
I think it's the word is Aya, which is probably a corruption of the word Arya. But in actual usage, Aya was used within even secular society, like a person like a servant would address their master as Aya. Like, meaning like master or lord. But within the Buddhist context, and I think perhaps even within secular society, Arya wouldn't be used to designate somebody who is of a higher class birth in purely secular terms. So that is not problematic. But there is something that's problematic here. What is it? I think you were going to say something. Yeah.
Oh, I'm not sure. I guess I was just wondering whether it was something
a certain power that his declaration of this statement made it spiritually powerful for anybody who was pure and non-violence.
Okay, that's a good question. I don't know how to answer it, but I mean, I don't have a definite answer to it, but perhaps because that declaration goes so contrary to what we would expect of Angulimala that it was able to generate that special spiritual force. And also I would think that before his transformation, Angulimala was a very physically and even psychically a very powerful person. Because he was able, the text says that he was able to kill 10, 20, 30 people at one shot. He was able to outrun, he was able to outrun a horse and an elephant. So he's physically very powerful. And perhaps that physical strength was accompanied by a kind of psychical strength, which with his spiritual transformation transformed itself into a kind of spiritual force. It's customary in Sri Lanka on almost every occasion when there's a religious ceremony, the monks will get together and then they recite these stanzas of blessing, and then it'll always end with Etena Sachavajena Soti Te Hotu Sabada Etena Sachavajena Sabadukha Vinasatu Etena Sachavajena Hotu Te Jayamangalam Etena Sachavajena Patu Tang Ratanatayang. So by this declaration of truth, may you always be well. By this declaration of truth, may all of your suffering be dispelled. By this declaration of truth, may you be victorious in what you're undertaking, successful in what you're undertaking. But, the kid who comes to the temple to get the blessing before his final exams could still flunk his final exam. The guy who's going out to look for a job could still fail to get a job. The sick person who wants the monks to recite the blessings doesn't get well immediately. So, even though we're supposed to have belief that the recitation generates some spiritual power, like if we don't have the inner spiritual power, the recitation doesn't take effect. But Angulimala must have had, there must have been something between that declaration and the recitation which caused that transformation to take place. But the question I had in mind is there something that's a bit peculiar in the description of this incident?
I thought it was unusual that Buddha had to say two things. He started with something that Angulimala didn't understand or that Angulimala himself found inaccurate. And so I had to ask myself, is Buddha not applying his consideration of full knowledge at this particular time? Or
he was not applying what?
I think we talked about omniscience.
Yeah.
When we read about this, the powers of omniscience, how would Buddha say something incorrect or as something that the student wouldn't understand right away?
Yeah. But even more specific than that.
My other thought was, Angulimala's own development at that point caused him to misunderstand the entire point of his practice.
Yeah, I think you have it. You're stating it almost exactly, but maybe Dan?
It has seems to have the flavor of negotiation. That he backs away, and sort of changes. We'll then say this instead. Normally it seems like the Buddha will use some sort of method of teaching, or will use a simile or kind of counsel the person he's talking to so that they'll arrive at this point, but it seems
Yeah.
that he's sort of like, well, in that case, then just say this, and change his instruction.
Yeah, you're both on this, in the right area. But as
The only thing that I could think of is he uses this as a teaching point.
as a what?
A teaching point. A good opportunity to teach.
Okay, again close, but there's something.
I don't think the Buddha lied. I think the Buddha give a not so perfect answer and let the student find the best answer what to tell them.
Okay, I think you're all sort of pretty much getting the right point. But it seems rather peculiar that, even though, of course, the Buddha isn't intending to speak a falsehood, but it seems that the Buddha is, as Angulimala thinks, you're asking me to tell a deliberate lie. How could the Buddha enjoin somebody to speak a falsehood?
He's just saying Angulimala has dispelled ignorance, and that's the only point of his life that really matters. It's not born can be a little confusing, but now he's basically saying to Angulimala, I think, you're a real being now. You're cognizant. You've dispelled this delusion. So what you did before was just that of following ridiculous aggregates in history. Now you are actually, you can do this. This is within your capacity at this place, at this lack of delusion. Although he's still a little bit because he doesn't really know what he's saying.
Yeah, but still, on the surface, it seems like the Buddha is asking him to tell a deliberate lie. How does one deal with it?
I still think the Buddha is saying something really big about the merit or the change in Angulimala, that he hasn't killed a single thing. That concludes how many times have I brushed off a mosquito in it, knowingly. I thought he was saying something quite precise there. Accurate, not just precise, but accurate about the nature of Angulimala's. And Angulimala's change was so severe, and he had done so much wrong, that he really, my impression, to be speculative, was that Angulimala was literally burned by bad actions thereafter. It would be too much for him to go back to anything, having so saturated himself in bad actions before, that even the brush of a small. And the word was intentional, correct? Did he say he is not intentionally? Did the word...
The word intentionally or deliberately occurs. Yeah,
deliberately,
intentionally
right? So
occurs.
Deliberately. Not unlike a Jain who walks one side of the street.
Yeah.
Maybe, so he may have stepped on something.
Of course, that's on.
But in his world of awareness was so accurate.
Was he testing him in a way?
I don't think the Buddha is testing him. The way I would resolve this, what seems to be the Buddha instructing him to speak a falsehood, is that the Buddha from the start was understanding the meaning of birth in a different sense from physical birth, but rather he was understanding it in terms of the spiritual transformation of Angulimala. Whereas Angulimala understood it in terms of physical birth. And in terms of physical birth, of course, he had killed many living beings. But after his transformation, then, he could say, taking his transformation to be the Aryan birth, the noble birth, then he could say truthfully that I haven't taken the life of, intentionally harmed or taken the life of any living being. And why, of all the incidents that might have taken place in the life of Angulimala after his ordination, why should this be especially included in the sutta?
Well, because it has to do with a birth.
I wasn't thinking of it from that angle.
Well, it does jive with culture. There's a practical element of, I'm looking at it now, I'm not looking at it from a point of view of Buddhism, I'm looking at it kind of as an outside view of saying that strategically it causes a collaboration with the history at that point in time, which is something that when you look at how the Buddha speaks and makes use of other words that were used in the tradition surrounding, there's almost an integration and making sure that this new, that his way is still in accordance with what is there, and it takes use of something that has a history there and makes sure that it's applicable. That's not meant to be cynical, it's not meant to be jaded, but it's to say that if that didn't actually happen, one could understand why a literary application was applied here.
Yeah, I'm not talking about specifically the Buddha's instruction to Angulimala and his reaction to it, but the whole incident. And it can be stated pretty simply. It doesn't take a PhD dissertation to explain it.
I think by looking at the suffering of the pain from that woman, that also remind him of the behavior that he did before that caused the pain of other people.
So what is it trying to show about Angulimala now?
He understands the formable truth, the first one.
As
Compassion?
Yeah, exactly. It shows his transformation. Before he was a brutal murderer a brutal murderer who was able to kill several people at a time without the slightest pangs of conscience. One has to be utterly merciless to be able to do that. You see people's, I can't speak from direct experience, but maybe from watching crime movies, when the stalker comes and corners the woman walking down the dark street, gets her into the alley, and she sees there's no escape. She's horrified, but he just goes right ahead with, the slash, they call it a slasher, that kind of film. So, it has to be utterly indifferent to the pain and fear and terror of others. But now Angulimala sees this woman, lying on the street, probably a poor woman without a home even. And, he's filled with compassion for her. And probably when he went to the Buddha, he wanted to know what he could do to help her. Or maybe he asked the Buddha, you do something to help her. And then the Buddha said, you're the one who has that ability now. You go there and make that declaration. And it will relieve her of that affliction. So it's showing a transformation, I think. It's highlighting the transformation in Angulimala's character. So now he's become, instead of a cruel, vicious murderer, a compassionate person. Katie wanted.
I just wanted to say that's such a interesting instructional tool. If sometimes there can be the desire, I'll go and I'll teach meditation in prison, or I'll something. This is a really clear, to me, it's a really almost a mathematical equation. If one's own purity doesn't match the depth of someone else's or that darkness, can't even try, because it won't have the spiritual impact. That is really a driver of one's own practice to know that if one really doesn't like deep, dark things in the world,
if one doesn't really
it wants to see dark things in the world neutralized, then one's own practice has to be at the same depth, opposite. Otherwise, another finger on the necklace.
Okay, good point. Okay, let us just continue so that we can finish the sutta. Okay, so now so far up to this point, it's a little bit strange that the text hasn't reported anything about Angulimala reaching any attainment. But I believe in some of as I mentioned last week, there are various versions of the sutta which have come down in different Buddhist schools. And some of the versions that have come down in some of the other schools state that Angulimala achieved stream entry during the course of his initial encounter with the Buddha, or maybe at some early period, or some early time within his life as a monk. But in the version that's come down in the Pali tradition, there's no statement about his attaining stream entry separately, but it just gives the account of his attainment of arahantship, which takes place after that incident, that encounter with the woman. So it says, before long, this is like a standard passage, before long, dwelling alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute, the Venerable Angulimala, by realizing for himself with direct knowledge, here and now entered on and abided in that supreme goal of the holy life, for the sake of which clansmen rightly go forth from the home life into homelessness. He directly knew that birth is finished, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, and there is no more coming back to any state of being. And so Angulimala had now become one of the arahants. Okay, so now he's finished his process of cultivation, of practicing the path. And now another incident is mentioned. Okay, so one day Angulimala goes into Savatthi on alms round. Again, putting this here, it's a little bit puzzling. Okay, now on that occasion, someone threw a clod and hit Venerable Angulimala's body, and someone else threw a stick and hit him, and someone else threw a potsherd and hit him. Apparently what had happened is that the report had maybe leaked out from King Pasenadi. Of course everybody was pressuring King Pasenadi, go out and get Angulimala and arrest him or kill him. And so since election season was coming around and he has to be able to, King Pasenadi, engage in effective debates with his opponent on the campaign trail. And so he has to be able to report that, there's nothing left to capture or to kill, but the Buddha has turned Angulimala into a monk. And the Buddha's not running for election, so I don't have to worry about the Buddha being my opponent. No, so probably through King Pasenadi, the word would have gotten out that Angulimala has become a monk. And people would have recognized Angulimala. Some people would have seen him from a distance and known that he was a big man with broad chest, strong arms. And so when he came into town on alms round, they would have identified him, and then they started throwing things at him. Of course, getting a stick thrown at you or a potsherd doesn't seem very frightening, but I would think people would have taken bigger stones and thrown them forcefully. Maybe somebody took a big, like a club, and clobbered him over the head. So then with blood running from his cut head, he would have had bad cuts on the head. His alms bowl was broken, so he wouldn't have been able to bring back any food that day. His robe was torn. So Angulimala comes to the Buddha, and the Buddha sees him approaching in the distance and says to him, "Bear it, Brahman. Bear it, Brahman. Endure it. You are experiencing here and now the result of deeds because of which you might have been tortured in hell for many years, for many hundreds of years, for many thousands of years." Okay, now this is referring rather concisely to the way karma ripens or matures. Now, normally the karma of killing even a single living being, especially a human being, would generate generally the act of killing another human being would have created very strong, unwholesome karma. And having killed many human beings, without any mercy, it would have created a great mass of evil karma. And if that Angulimala had continued to live a normal life, not becoming a monk, not becoming an arahant, when that karma ripened, it would have caused a rebirth in hell. And then there was so much heavy karma from killing many, many people that he would have had to suffer in hell not just for a short period, but even for many thousands of years. But now, through his attainment of enlightenment, of arhatship, Angulimala has stopped the cycle of birth and death. So he won't take rebirth anymore. And so all of that unwholesome karma will have no more opportunity to ripen, except there's some portion of that karma which has the potential to ripen in this present life. And in this case, probably because Angulimala had become not simply a monk, but he'd become very compassionate and an arahat, so that stopped the severity of that unwholesome karma. So instead of getting terribly injured or even killed in this life, it came back to him in the form simply of getting this bad beating when on his arms round. And the stories or the narratives that come down in these suttas are of necessity somewhat abridged. So it could be the case that this went on for days and weeks until maybe the people of the town came to the Buddha, or the Buddha went out to them and spoke to them and told them that Angulimala has now become an enlightened, liberated, holy person. And so Angulimala could have gotten a much worse beating than this just brief account of the incident indicates. But the point here, it seems, is that's trying to be conveyed, that the text is trying to convey, is that by attaining liberation, he's freed from the terrible results that his dreadful deeds would have brought him if he hadn't been so liberated. Maybe to us, with our Judeo-Christian sense of justice, it might seem unfair. Like, how come he's literally getting away with murder? We'd say he's just getting away with a slap on the wrist. While other people who are not so fortunate, who kill maybe just one person, have to endure terrible results. But that's the way the karma functions. Okay, any questions, comments, or ideas about this? Okay, Dan?
Just the question about, it seems as though his path to enlightenment, it's remained, I kind of, the king's question from the previous page stays in my mind, how is it possible that a man like this could, just adding obtain enlightenment, wouldn't the karma, if what kind of seems left out of the sutta, how the negative karma, influences his path?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we had a little discussion about that question last week, without coming to a resolution to it. Because it seems, just to recapitulate what we said last week, it seems that for anybody to achieve arhatship in one life like this, to meet the Buddha, to have the opportunity to meet the Buddha, to go forth, and to achieve arhatship within, I would assume, a fairly short period, one would have to have in previous lives practiced the Buddha's path, or at least wholesome paths, in many, many lives, and accumulated good paramis, or spiritual qualities. And so then the question would come up, first question, would it be possible for somebody who had so many wholesome tendencies to then deviate from that path and take up the life of a vicious murderer? Again, I don't know. And then if somebody commits so many terrible murders, how is it possible for them, again, to cultivate and become, fully enlightened arhat? things that I don't know. But one point that was brought up last week, whether the sutta is in all respects historically true or not, but a message seems to be conveyed by the sutta, which is, somebody want to repeat the message coming through? I think it was Richard who stated it last week.
It's saying that you can't be worse than Angulimala.
Mala,
so
yeah.
you can't say that there's no point in your following the way of the Buddha because you have no hope.
Because you have, yeah, basically that's it. It seems to be saying that, if you think you're having trouble because that you can't practice because in your sleep last night you semi-consciously slapped a mosquito, or because you have a lot of anger or lust or laziness, you have no excuse, because here we have the worst type of person and he did it, so you can do it too. There's always hope for you. Even me. Really?
Klaus Barbie might be worse.
Klaus?
Barbie? Yes, or Adolf Eichmann.
Yeah, of course I know Adolf Eichmann. Klaus Barbie, I don't...
Oh, he tore lots of people to shreds.
Oh. Yeah.
When there is no more rebirth,
Yeah.
what is there?
Oh. You have to go and listen to the lectures on Sutta number 72.
Okay.
Kaidi has to put them up. They'll go up on YouTube. I noticed yesterday that the last lecture that put up on YouTube was number 67. So I told Kaidi, please put up the more recent ones. Of course, it's not so directly, I just want to take questions that really directly bear on the sutta. Katie.
I did just want to say this week I saw on the news, the DC sniper, the young man who was under the influence. I think Malvo, the older man might, anyway. The young
That
man
was about 10 years ago,
yes,
was it?
and he was testifying, and he was trying to convey to the family, he said, I was a monster. I mean, this kid, he fell under the influence of a teacher, so he had both high faith, and he had this student devotion.
Yeah.
And today, 10 years later, he's like, just telling everybody, I was a monster. I was a kid, I'm responsible, but I was a monster. Try to move on with your lives. He had the same murderous to being this person who's trying to say, don't let me destroy your whole life. He's described himself as a monster previously. And that was my other thought, was somehow this person was born, this Angulimala was born into a noble family.
Yeah.
And I think this is the point, I'm not sure, but I think when I read Richard Gombrich's words on this sutta, I think he was saying that there's a theory that Angulimala was a student of a brigand and was fulfilling his obligation to a teacher. And we know this, I'm really going to go there now with too much speculation, but we do know this about young minds, young juvenile, adolescent minds full of chemistry, and young males are particularly able to be taught to become this way.
Yeah.
So through sheer devotion to a student, this faith caught at a young time.
Yeah.
He could have developed a 10-year habit, which is obscene.
Yeah. This is actually what Richard Gombrich said is in accordance with the commentarial explanation of how Angulimala became the terrible murderer. Well, the commentary says, at Angulimala's birth there were inauspicious signs, and his horoscope showed that he was born under the influence of the planets or whatever that determines one as a criminal or a murderer, but his parents brought him up well and tried to give him ethical training, and he turned out to be a good boy, but then he went to this university, Takshila, to study, and then he became such a good student, so devoted to his teacher, that his fellow students became jealous of him, and by spreading malicious rumors in his teacher's ear, they turned the teacher against him. Then here it gets a little improbable to me, the teacher didn't want to knock Angulimala off directly, so instead he instructed him to become a murderer with the thought that Angulimala would then get apprehended by the authorities and beheaded. And that was the way to get revenge on him.
I just think we do see examples of this very thing all the time today.
Yeah.
You take a young person who needs family, they have faith, they're going to show this extreme devotion. We
Yeah.
look at the age of military joining, which is, I'm not criticizing, but I'm just saying it's a very natural thing to get someone to follow devotedly from a certain age and to do almost anything.
Yeah.
Did Buddha say anything about a person going crazy and the actions the crazy person does? Does that have the same karmic repercussions?
I'm trying to think of what the Buddha, whether there are any incidents of somebody going crazy and the Buddha making pronouncements about the karmic results of those actions. But in terms of the Vinaya, if somebody goes crazy or they become insane to the point where they don't really know what they're doing, and then they break any of the precepts, including the most fundamental precepts, and then they come back to a state of soundness of mind, they cannot be penalized on account of, in terms of monastic discipline, in terms of their actions during that period of madness. So if somebody is mad, and I think even if he kills somebody, takes a human life, and then he recovers his sanity, and it's known that he was utterly mad, he won't be expelled from the order. But if somebody in a normal frame of mind takes life, a human life, then he has to be expelled from the order. And since you mentioned Richard Gumbridge, I just want to bring up one other point. I do hope he's listening. In his book, it's called The Beginnings of Buddhism, the Conditional Genesis of Early Buddhism. He has a chapter on Angulimala in which he presents the hypothesis that Angulimala had become the apprentice, had become the follower of a sect of, call it a proto-Shaivite sect. The Shaivites are the devotees in India of the god Shiva, and they can be, don't meet them on a dark street at night. They can be fierce, and they don't have the precepts of avoiding the destruction of life. They're known sometimes to be even murderous, some of the subsects of the Shaivites. And so Richard Gumbridge's hypothesis is that Angulimala had become a member of one of these sects which practiced ritualistic murders, carrying out murders of innocent people as a form of ritual. And then Gumbridge tried to give some proof by his way of construing the verses of Angulimala in the in the Sutta. But the view of Richard Gumbridge has been pretty much rejected by a lot of Indologists on the basis that there's no indications in any contemporary Indian literature or even for centuries of anything like a Shaivite type of sect that practiced the ritualistic murder of human beings. Okay, any other points to bring up? Okay, then we'll stop for the day, and you can read the verses on your own. I think that they are self-explanatory. So maybe the last few verses are nice just to read without explanation. They're self-explanatory, but just to read them together is nice. Maybe you could try all reading them, everybody reading simultaneously out loud. Starting with the verse on page 716, harmless is the name I bear. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Harmless is the name I bear, though I was dangerous in the past. The name I bear today is true. I hurt no living being at all. Just explanation. Angulimala's given name, before he became a murderer, was ahingsaka, which means the one who harms no one, or harmless. So now he's saying that this is truly my name, because now I'm not harming living beings at all. Okay, continue. 1, 2, 3. And though I once lived as a bandit, known to all as finger garland, that's Angulimala, one whom the great flood swept along, I went for refuge to the Buddha. And though I once was bloody-handed with the name of finger garland, see the refuge I have found, the bond of being has been cut. While I did many deeds that lead to rebirth in the evil realms, yet their result has reached me now, and so I eat free from debt. They are fools and have no sense, who give themselves to negligence, but those of wisdom guard diligence and treat it as their greatest good. Do not give way to negligence, nor seek delight in sensual pleasures, but meditate with diligence so as to reach the perfect bliss. So welcome to that choice of mine, and let it stand, it was not ill-made. Of all the teachings resorted to, I have come to the very best. So welcome to that choice of mine, and let it stand, it was not ill-made. I have attained the triple knowledge and done all that the Buddha teaches. And what is the triple knowledge? Nobody knows.
Isn't it the knowledge of impermanence, not self?
No.
Buddha Dharma Sangha.
No, that's the refuge, not the knowledge.
Oh, yes.
No.
Knowledge of one's past lives and the seeing others passing on according to their karmic repercussions.
Yeah.
These destruction of pains.
Yeah. Okay, so it's the knowledge by which one can recollect one's past lives. The knowledge was called the knowledge of the divine eye, by which one sees how beings pass away and take rebirth in accordance with their karma, and the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas, the taints or influxes, the basic defilements.
So I want to say I didn't know that those are jhanic knowledges. Those are things.
They arise on the basis of the four jhanas. Yeah. Okay, now we won't have the discussion today because there's a program going on here, and then I have to give a lecture in that program at 2 p.m. and after the lunch, and I want to take a little break. So I think we discussed all of the points that come out from the sutta within this class. Now after this class, there's going to be a bit of a hiatus, a bit of a long break. First, next week, October 13th, that is the day of our Buddhist Global Relief Walk. So I want to encourage all of you, or as many as possible, to come and join our walk to feed the hungry. This will be a walk to generate funds in order to support the projects of Buddhist Global Relief, which feed hungry people and provide education to poor girls and hunger relief to hungry people. Richard?
I couldn't tell on the website. Is there supposed to be some routine for people to commit themselves to funding? That is, are people supposed to get tax statements that they can send in for tax release for payments that they make, or is there supposed to be some kind of sign-up sheet that you give to people when they write in how much they're committing or something like that?
Well, when one gives through first giving, then one gets an acknowledgement, which I think states that you have given to a 501c3 non-profit, and then that can be used for purposes of tax. Excuse me.
Where do you
of taxes.
Make those statements? Says if I'm going to ask people to fund me for the walk or something, what am I supposed to give them?
You put it, Johnny. You want to explain?
Actually, at the website, if you use First Giving, you can send promotional email from there. Once the second they donate from First Giving automatically send an email. The email itself has all the detail, what kind of charity is for this global relief. The easiest way for you to test it out is you make a donation towards Bond Day, then you get an email automatically.
So then, what am I supposed to be telling other people? Am I saying, look, give me your email address and I'll have an email sent to you, or what? What? I don't understand. That is, am I supposed to collect cash from people, hand it in, then I get what?
If you make a fundraising page on First Giving,
I've been to the
have you made your own fundraising page?
Make your own fundraising page.
Yeah, there's a tab to make you have your own fundraising page, and you can write your own letter online, send out to your friends, and they'll get your letter asking them to donate to your page. If you want them
I don't know. I tried that. It didn't happen. I must have missed something.
Maybe we can look at it on one of the computers at some point. Maybe it shows. Yeah, I can show you.
Okay, but let me just continue with the. Okay, then for the 3 weeks after that, then I won't be here. I will be in California, 20th, 27th, and the first one in November. I think that's the 3rd. So the next class that we have will be November 10th, and that for that class we can go back to the Guanyin Ho, and also at Zhuangyan Monastery from October 13th for 3 weeks after that. Venerable Czech Dhammadvipa from the Czech Republic, he's giving a 3-week meditation course here. So that would be a very good opportunity for anybody here who wants to do extended period of meditation. Of course, if you have the 3 weeks, you could register for 3 weeks. If that's too long, you can register for 1 week at a time. For that, you can speak to people in the office. You'll see posters around, or you go to the website of Buddhist Association of the United States. You shake your head like you've gone?
No.
Oh, I thought like you had gone there and there was something wrong with that. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang param. Etavadacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavadacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhudanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavadacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavakupadaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanino dukkha pamuchantu posantu nibbutting. Okay, then we can end with 3 bows to the Buddha. 3 half bows to the Buddha.
Bow to Bande.